I am Tamar Ish Shalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. A few months ago, we were having Friday night dinner with American Jewish friends of ours, and naturally, at some point during the evening, the conversation turned to how our Jewish lives have changed over the past year and a half. Our host shared how much more intense his Jewish identity has become. He used to care about Israel, but mostly in a general way, just following the big headlines. Day to day, his Jewish identity came through morning prayer, for instance. He's an observant Jew. But now there's a new ritual, waking up, checking what happened in Israel while he was asleep, and refreshing the Call Me Back page, hoping a new emergency episode had dropped. Listening to the podcast, he said, has become a part of his Jewish identity, a defining part of it. There's no question about it. Call Me Back by Dan Senor has become the most influential podcast in the American Jewish world today. It's hard to find anyone who disagrees. It's more than just a podcast. It's a cultural moment across synagogues, conferences, and community gatherings. You'll hear people quoting it, referencing it, sometimes even opening their own events with the same familiar tone Dan uses to open each episode. But this isn't just about Israel or just about America. It's about the conversation in between, the dialogue that stretches across oceans and identities, threading together Jewish life, politics, and meaning in real time. Full disclosure, my husband, Davial, is a regular guest on the show. Hi, Dan. It's great to have you with me.
Good to be with you, Tamar. The podcast has done well in spite of Nadav's regular appearances. So
I apologize. I apologize for that.
Yeah. But it's great to be with you.
How are you doing these days?
It's I feel like since October 7th, every week is 3 days, which is yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Because you're always just bracing for. You're either reacting to what happened yesterday or you're bracing for what could happen tomorrow. The last few days we passed day 600 since the war, and that is just every one of these milestones. I remember 6 months was a big milestone. I remember not in a good way, like a sad, dark milestone. Then the 1 year anniversary, and now here we are. 600 days. So, and just imagine if there's still hostages being held 600 days in. Imagine Israel still fighting a war on multiple fronts. 600 days in, something that the Israeli army, the Israeli society, the Israeli reserve system was never structured, prepared, properly resourced to be able to endure a war like this for so long. And then just developments that I follow from Israel that I just take for granted, like, a few nights ago, friends of mine from the Tel Aviv area and surrounding areas told me, oh, yeah, the sirens went off at 2 a.m. last night or 3 a.m. At what parts of the country were hit with that particular Houthi attack that required the sirens going off and everyone going into their mamads, into their safe rooms in the middle of the night. It affected something like 2 million people, 2 million Israelis.
Almost half a country.
Just to think like on a regular weeknight, about 2 million people are waking up in the middle of the night and going into a safe room, waiting for the all clear sign, and then they just get up the next morning and they go to work as though and they're all exhausted, obviously, and they just to think that this is going on and on and on, and I don't really see an end in sight, even if there are various ceasefire deals, and they just seem steps along a path of a much longer term existence, not permanent, God willing, but definitely not, ending anytime soon. So obviously there's the Israel aspect that's can be dispiriting at times. There are moments obviously where it can be very inspiring, but generally speaking, just the state Israel's in is dispiriting, regardless of how much success Israel has had in repelling these threats. And then, what you're seeing, I think, a lot firsthand here is here in the United States is just how normalized anti-Semitism has become and how much it's come to the surface, and there are no signs that is going to go back beneath the surface, and it's emerged from corners that I think any of us could have ever imagined. And I think for many of us, me included, because you asked me how I'm doing, it's just what's settling in is this is our new normal. This is this is, we have this, we romanticize the way Jewish life was in the diaspora, specifically in the United States. And I break out the United States from other parts of the diaspora because I think each of these countries has their own dynamics, and the U.S. situation is unique than from say the UK or from Australia or from Canada. I'm happy to talk about those too. But here in the United States, just raising two children who are Jewish, who are part of a Jewish community, who are very aware of their Jewish identity, they're teenagers. So we'll be 2 years into this new reality of Jewish life in America, and pretty soon, that's going to be all they know. They're not really going to remember what Jewish life in America was before October 7th. And so this is their new normal. There's much I'm optimistic about in Jewish life in America, but just this sense that, the line I use is on October 7th, Israel was at war, and on October 8th, the diaspora was under attack. And I think my children, and therefore my wife and me, are very aware of this sort of menacing feeling that's just kind of always on the surface, above the surface, bubbling up above the surface. It's pretty depressing.
Insanity is the new normal. Following on that, just days after you gave your State of World Jewry address, the horrifying terror attack took place in Washington, D.C., near the Jewish Museum. And sadly, many of your observations in that speech became even more urgent in light of the attack. You painted a pretty stark picture of American Jews being prominent but weak. Can you unpack that for us? I mean, how can both of those realities exist at the same time?
I think that before October 7th, the American Jewish community, American Jews, were in leadership roles or in positions of extraordinary success and influence in almost every sector and aspect of American life. I mean, really, you can't, just obviously American business and finance, American Jews were proudly and publicly in very senior positions in academia, at the universities, in the sciences, in the tech community. You go to the Bay Area, you go to almost every one of the major tech companies or major venture funds in Silicon Valley. You'll find someone who's Jewish who plays a leadership role, prominent role, achieved extraordinary success. Medicine, the arts, the creative arts, obviously in that sector, Hollywood, the movie and television scene. I really could do this all day long. Just about every aspect. Sports, which is a sector of entertainment. We just had here what's called the Final Four. I don't know how much you would follow this, but the Final Four is the men's college the one that gets the most attention is the men's college basketball tournament, which is a big deal. The NCAA men's basketball tournament. And the 4 teams that made it into the Final Four, so this is like national sports coverage, 3 of the 4 coaches, so 3 of the coaches of the 4 teams that made it into this grand finale are Jewish. So, it's just everywhere you go, you see Jewish leadership and incredible contributions made to American society, to every aspect. Again, in philanthropy, in the creative arts, in business, in academia, like you see Jewish life everywhere, which one would think that then if Jews are under siege, the broader society would rally to their defense. That would be the logical thing. And in fact, it's been the opposite. So Jews have had extraordinary prominence and influence. And yet when Jews are under siege, the line that Douglas Murray uses, which I've quoted a lot, where he says, in that flash of October 7th, when the light, like the sky lit up on October 7th, and in that flash, you look all around you. You look to your left, you look to your right, you look in front of you, you look behind you to see who's standing with you. And in that flash, we realized that not many people were standing with us. You realize how fragile and unreliable and superficial our notion of prominence is, right? Because if in that flash, when it really matters and we are under attack, if there aren't others willing to stand with us en masse, then you realize, prominence and prestige are meaningless. And they really are, actually. They really are. That is, I think, a big wake-up call for many in the American Jewish communities. All this stuff's meaningless. I have friends who've made major contributions and led, capital-raising drives at some of the most elite universities in America. And then they were watching what's happening at these campuses after October 7th. And they're calling, the people they normally deal with at these universities, say, what is going on? There's like pogroms happening at this campus, where I've built a library and a dormitory and a dining, I've made all these extraordinary, and their calls don't even get returned. That's what it means to be prominent but weak.
And how do you understand that, on the morning of October 7th or 8th of October, American Jews looked to the right and to the left and didn't really find their allies?
Well, I'll give you different shades of darkness because I don't want to make this totally, kind of a downward spiral of a conversation. If you start at the darkest level, and this is something I talked about in my address, this is actually shouldn't be surprising at all. That it is of a type that we've seen throughout Jewish history. If you, go into Google or go into your favorite LLM and you type in the word anti-Semitism in a particular century, tell me about anti-Semitism in the 15th century or the 18th century or the 20th century, or just pick your century. What you will see will blow your mind in terms of how persistent anti-Semitism has been throughout the world, throughout history. And it doesn't always have this pattern, but this pattern has existed before. I focused in my speech on the book From the Pity of It All, which is a book that has had a huge influence on me. I'd read it before, long before October 7th, but I read it again after October 7th. It chronicles basically the 200 years of Jewish life in Germany leading up to 1933. The book basically ends at 1933. And so you have, 17 mid to late 1700 Germany, Jewish life. You have the 1800s. And you see that German Jews, came from nothing, and they made these totally disproportionate. Their population was always less than their percentage. The Jewish population in Germany was never more than 1% of the total population. But their contributions to German society, to the German economy, to German academia, to the modernization of Germany were so disproportionate to their size. In fact, there's one vignette in the book that still gives me chills, which is on the eve of 1933, as the Third Reich is consolidating power, as the Nazis are consolidating power, the Berlin Jewish community cannot believe everybody would turn on them. And so they thought, well, certainly they must appreciate how much we've contributed to Germany, to the growth and the modernization and the flourishing of Germany. So what we'll do is we'll literally write down in a journal every German Jewish leader, and describe what they did. This one ran the hospital. This one ran the largest bank. This one, made this important contribution in science. This one, they literally, it's as I'm describing it, it's pathetic, right? And they chronicle this all of this, and they create this book of several thousand names, and they think, okay, so the book has survived history be used as an example of how much destruction the Nazis did to Germany, because it wiped out this people that had been contributing so much. That's how the book is remembered. But I actually, post October 7th, think of that journal in a different way, which is this desperation to say, look how much we've given. Why don't you have our back? Is reminiscent. I'm not, by the way, by no means am I suggesting I think we're in a 1933 situation. So I don't think that's what's going on. But I do think that prominence ultimately buys you very little. In fact, prominence can sometimes be used as a weapon against you, and that is the pattern. And we've seen that now when American Jewish leaders explain, try to over-explain all they've given and contributed to the growth and advancement of the modernization of the United States. It's almost used against them, like the Jews are too powerful. That's something we've seen throughout history. So if I wanted to get really dark, I would say that this is just the old anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head. I don't know if that's true, by the way. It may not be the old anti-Semitism. It may be something new and different that we haven't seen before. If I were to be less dark, but still staying in the vein of being somewhat dark, because this is a Jewish conversation, I would say that, and I want to be careful here not to generalize too much, because there are obviously some very notable exceptions, but I think many American Jews became so integrated and assimilated into daily American life that they never leaned into their Judaism and their Jewish identity and their Jewish community in a meaningful way, they didn't have like a thick Jewish identity. So when they were doing everything they were doing in all these different sectors, we talked about universities a minute ago, so let's just stay with that example. So if you were someone who raised a lot of money and helped, endow professors and, build out the growth of an academic institution and provide scholarships for people who can't afford it, you never said, look, I'm doing this as an American Jewish leader because I care about America and I care about American Jewish life. I care about Jewish life in America. And you need to understand that if things go sideways for Jewish life on campus, that's going to be a huge problem for me. Like, I'm not sure many of the the philanthropists that were getting engaged with these universities were making that clear, that their Jewish identity and their Jewish community was extremely important to them. And so that's what I mean when I say prominent but weak. Sure, they were prominent, but their Jewish identity was weak. And therefore, many pockets of elite American society didn't say, I don't want to, John Goldstein, I'm just picking a name here. They didn't say, many pockets of elite society didn't say John Goldstein is doing this for us in part because he cares about Jewish life. They're saying John Goldstein is like John Smith or John Christopher. He's just another donor to us. And so when the Jews are under siege, the recipients of all this Jewish engagement in the civic square here, the beneficiaries of it, don't view it as, they don't feel any sense of responsibility to protect John Goldstein as a Jew. They say protect John Goldstein, but they don't have to protect John Goldstein as a Jew. So when John Goldstein complains that there's like a pogrom happening on the campus and that's not okay, it's just not a priority. And so I blame a dynamic that has existed that is as old as time, which is anti-Semitism. But I do, to some degree, think that we Jews here in the U.S. and elsewhere need to also take a hard look at how we've engaged in terms of both inwardly and externally with our inwardly and outwardly with our Judaism.
Oh, that's an interesting analysis. And I'm staying with what's happening on campuses. Until recently, the rule of thumb was left-wing anti-Semitism is very vocal. It shows up mostly as hate speech or, in extreme cases, vandalism. But lethal violence came from the far right, like in Pittsburgh and other tragic examples. Then came the shooting in D.C. and shattered that equation. Did that event surprise you, the shift from campus rhetoric to deadly violence? Or given how many times we've heard chants like globalize the intifada, did it feel inevitable that someone would eventually listen to the call and globalize it?
Yeah, so I'm really sad to say that I am not surprised. I mean, I was horrified by what happened in Washington, but I wasn't surprised for the exact reason you're saying, which is there's been this gradual escalation, not so gradual, but there's been this ramping up of the rhetoric against Israel and against Jews, and it's been tolerated. When I would say to people, you know, these protests, these encampments, accusing Israel of genocide, accusing Israel of apartheid, well, if you convince enough people that a certain country and a certain population, the overwhelming majority of American Jews and diaspora Jews, according to any survey, the overwhelming majority identify as Zionists. So you're basically saying you support Israel, and if you support Israel, then according to the rhetoric, according to this line, you are supporting a genocidal state, and you are supporting apartheid, and you are supporting, you know, mass slaughter of children, or whatever the latest canard is. When I would say, you know, this is really dangerous language, and words have consequences, and words infect people's minds, and we've seen that throughout history. If you keep tolerating it, things are going to spiral out of control. People say, no, they're just kids. They're just throwing around crazy language, and you know, this is, you know, you can't overreact to it. And then it wasn't just kids who were doing it. Then it was members of Congress using that language. Then it was presidential candidates using that language. Then, I mean, I can keep going on. I mean, then it's, you know, you start seeing this language being thrown around in the media. At some point, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that the logical extension of that rhetoric is someone saying, well, look, I've got to take matters into my own hands. I mean, these people are accused of genocide. If you read the manifesto of the murderer, the terrorist who waged the attack in Washington, D.C., I mean, he talks about having tried to change U.S. policy or influence U.S. policy, or therefore influence Israeli policy, to upend the genocide. And it wasn't working. He tried this, he tried that, he tried that. So, you know, at some point, people are going to say, well, we've tried all these other things and there's no progress. I'm going to go to the next level. So it's, like I said, it's completely demoralizing, but it shouldn't surprise anyone. When you throw this kind of language around, what do you expect? You're turning your average Jewish citizen into someone, according to the caricature, who's complicit in genocide. So when you're walking down the street and you see that person, whether he's wearing a yarmulke or he's wearing a Magen David or he's wearing a hostage pin, that person, or is walking out of a Jewish day school, that person is complicit in genocide. That puts all of us at risk.
I can't help but thinking about how the framework of settler colonialism that's so dominant in progressive academic spaces lays in a way the ideological groundwork for this kind of violence, even if non-intentional, because if this isn't a national conflict between two peoples, but a one-sided story in which Jews are just foreign invaders with no right to live from the river to the sea, then violence against any Israeli or even any Jewish supporter of Israel becomes justified. Why do you think this theory has gained so much followers in American academia?
I think there's a few things going on. I think it's symptomatic of something bigger going on, which is, I mean, if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, at every phase of anti-Semitism throughout its history, if you had to like really sum up, because it's very hard to describe exactly what anti-Semitism is, because it's more than just like disliking the other or viewing the Jew as the other and therefore the Jew as the outsider. The best description I can think of or summary, which I hear from everyone who I consult on this, people like Yossi Klein Halevi or Dara Horn, if you had to boil it down, it's wherever anti-Semitism has occurred, it defines a certain ideal for the society that the society is trying to achieve, and then the Jews are the obstacle to achieving that ideal. So, obviously in Nazi Germany, the objective was race purity. The Jews were the obstacle. In socialist and communist countries, the goal is Marxism, and the Jews are the dirty cosmopolitan, business people that are the obstacle. I mean, you really can go throughout, Jew as the Christ killer. I mean, just go all the way back. You can go back centuries and millennia, and the Jew is always the obstacle to whatever the ideal is. And so if you think about the trend in academia today, and it's not just academia, it's sort of the zeitgeist of a lot of our debates and, political discourse in the U.S. and the West over the last number of years, it's been about a lot about imperialism, colonialism. I mean, what is the whole woke agenda about? It's awakening against institutionalized racism and America's quote unquote original sin. Again, their words, not ours, of institutionalized racism. And so this has been so much part of the zeitgeist. And so if you think about it then in national sovereign terms, what is the country that is the obstacle? There are elements within American society that are obstacles to correcting that wrong. But if you think about it among nations, Israel then becomes the embodiment of the nation that is the obstacle to correcting that wrong. And correcting that wrong is the ideal. We need to correct that wrong. It is. And now, of course, so that I think that's the structure, how you have to think about how Israel kind of landed itself in this political discourse. It's wrong, of course, and we could spend a whole hour talking about how historically inaccurate that characterization of Israel is. But that's where Israel has landed itself, and you have a lot of academics who have bought into that as part of their overall anti-Western civilizational version of events, version of history. And then you get into the process. So what's happened at these universities is there's very much groupthink in terms of the hiring of faculty. There's very much groupthink and a kind of a monolithic approach in terms of worldview for professors who pursue tenure, because those who pursue tenure are hired by their peers. Effectively, they're selected for tenure by their peers. They're chosen by the departments that they work in, the faculty, the department heads at these universities. And so, the inmates have been running the asylum at many of these places. And so they recruit for a certain worldview, this worldview that I'm articulating, that, again, it's not just about Israel. It's also about, I do think it's an anti-Western, anti-actually U.S. orientation, anti-Judeo-Christian set of ideas and principles and values. They have created this like hold, almost like a monopoly on the hiring process at many of these institutions, not all of them, but at many of them. So that's part of it. And then it's not just the faculty positions, it's also the non-faculty positions. So take, for instance, the people who are staffing the admissions committees at these universities, the people making the decisions about who gets into the universities, and the premium that it was being put on. I mean, I've spoken to heads of universities who say, our biggest problem are the students we're getting from these schools. And we have sent a message. Again, I think it's going to start changing now, but up to now, they had been, at least the last number of years, many of the most prestigious academic institutions in the United States have sent a message that there's a premium put on your application if you come from the social activist background. And so students have been incentivized who want to apply to the most prestigious schools to demonstrate that they have, some kind of intense, in many cases, radical social activist background or track record in their, years before applying to college. And so admissions committees are biased in favor of those kinds of students. One professor at the University of Pennsylvania said to me, he said, part of the problem is because of the grade inflation in high schools, in many high schools, for many of the students applying to a place like the University of Pennsylvania, which is the top American school, and the test scores are all very competitive. These kids are all very bright. So basically, all these kids, if you just look at them numerically, their quantitative record, it's all very strong. Strong SATs and SATs, strong GPA. I mean, these are kids with impressive academic records. This one may be a quarter of a point better here. This one may be half a point better there. But at the end of the day, it's very hard for us to distinguish one applicant from another just based on their academic record. So we look for these other things, these other stories, these narratives. And what our admissions committee have been, seeking out are applicants who have the story of, yes, you're a super smart kid, but you've also been an activist. And so you get what you reward. And many of these universities rewarding with admissions and, in many cases, scholarships and all the rest and fellowships, students who have a demonstrated track record of being radical activists. So it's a perfect storm because you have all these students in the campus, and then you have tenured faculty, and they all are sharing this worldview. And you come away from saying it, why would anyone, not just an American Jew, why would anyone in the right mind want their kid to go to one of these schools?
But you mentioned change, and a lot of us hoped and longed for a moral reckoning in academia, in Ivy League schools. We looked for change, especially after the rot was so amazingly exposed during the congressional hearings with the presidents of three major universities. Do you think the recent harsh actions taken by the administration are aimed at fixing what's broken and creating a better, more principled academic environment, one that will be free of anti-Semitism as well? Or are they ultimately designed to crush academic freedom and leave us with just a weaker university system?
I think there is legitimate debate right now about the various demands being made of different universities, depending on the universities. Some demands are specific to certain universities by the administration. I think it's legitimate to have a discussion, a debate about, is this warranted? Is this too heavy-handed? Is this a requirement that's unrealistic? In many cases, they're not. I could point to certain schools where I think the list of demands is totally reasonable. But whatever, let's debate it. I think that's a fair discussion, and I think there'll be negotiations and there'll be some kind of compromise with a lot of these schools. What I don't think is open to debate. I mean, people are free to debate it. I just don't buy it. I don't think it's debatable. But for this administration putting a spotlight on these issues, these universities would not be dealing with a reckoning on these longstanding problems that there was no pressure on them to deal with. I really don't believe that. It still blows my mind, and I just said this the other day somewhere. It just blows my mind that in the fall of 2024, when Kamala Harris was running for president, that she didn't see fit to find some opportunity to show up at some American campus and stand shoulder to shoulder with American Jewish students. She would have been welcomed like a hero if she did that. She wouldn't have had to get into the politics and talk about specific issues. She wouldn't have had to talk about complexity of Middle East policy. She simply could have said, there is pervasive anti-Semitism at these institutions, and we can't stand for it anymore. And these students are the victims of it and the targets of it, and I stand with them. And she didn't. And I still don't know why she didn't. I mean, I have a theory as to why she didn't, but whatever. I don't know for sure why she didn't. And I think that was emblematic of where we were in the discourse about this problem in the fall of 24, which is a big part of the country and a big part of our leadership didn't want to touch it, didn't want to go near it, which basically gave a green light to all these universities to just continue business as usual. And maybe at some point they'll deal with it. There's a little bit of a problem. We got to tweak this. We got to fix that. But there was no sense of urgency. And then Trump gets in and says, not only is there urgency, you have a crisis on your hands. You have a crisis. And suddenly all these universities are producing reports and chronicling all the anti-Semitism. And by the way, it's mind-blowing when I don't know if you read like the Harvard report. It's just to see what has been going on there for years and years and years, and you realize how entrenched it was. These institutions had been captured by these crazy ideas and, dare I say, these crazy people. And so, just full disclosure, I went to Harvard. I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School, so I'm paying close attention to Harvard, but not just Harvard. I'm in touch with a lot of these different universities, and I have this WhatsApp group with a bunch of my classmates from Harvard Business School, some close friends of mine, and we get into this discussion about what Trump is doing and as it relates to Harvard, and then one of my friends, one of my classmates, pointed out he's a trustee of another institution, another university, and he said, there's a growing sense that it's a version of what you just said. It's not really about anti-Semitism. Trump is, under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, is really has a much bigger agenda for what he wants to do to the universities. And we need to be very careful about that. And my response to that is maybe not. But how about just fix the thing? Like, in other words, I'm happy to have that debate all day long about whether or not there's some bigger agenda and whether it's merit, whether it deserves merit in terms of pursuing it. We can talk about that all day long. But fix the thing. The thing is anti-Semitism. That is what is pervasive right now. That is what, by the way, you talk to any of these heads of these universities who are fighting with the Trump administration, they will say, we have an anti-Semitism problem at our university. They can see that now. And so focus on fixing that. And then you could say, look, we fixed that, but we think now you're going too far with this and this and this. But I just think it's a little disingenuous to start questioning the motives of the government in this back and forth before you've addressed the core problem. Address the core problem and then say, we've addressed the core problem, but all this other stuff is ridiculous. Address the core problem. In that sense, it's not a negotiation. You don't get to say, well, I'll address the core problem if you concede that you're not really going to do these other things because those aren't about the core problem. No, fix the core problem.
Do the right thing first.
Right.
Do you think we will be seeing a shift in the universities Jewish kids will be attending the next 5 to 10 years?
I think we are watching before our eyes right now the kind of the center of gravity shifting beneath the feet of higher education in America. And I think for many highly educated American Jews, for a long time, back to our point about prestige and prominence, despite being weak, they wanted to get to, they and their parents wanted them to get to the best, what we think of as the most elite colleges in the country, mostly liberal arts colleges, largely focused in the Northeast and the Midwest, but not exclusively. That was the goal. That is what many of these kids aspired to accomplish. And I think that is changing. I think students today, Jewish students, are looking at universities that would have never been on their radar 10, 15 years ago, or even 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, because the allure of an elite, prestigious university is not that alluring when, anti-Semites wearing keffiyehs as masks storm your library in the middle of your studying for finals. Prestige of that university is suddenly a lot less attractive, and you want to go somewhere sane and where you're welcomed and where you're respected and where a vibrant Jewish life is viewed as a feature, not a bug, in that campus. And I think there are some courageous and thoughtful and entrepreneurial chancellors and presidents of universities, largely in the South, but not only in the South, who are seizing that and looking to create environments where Jews can flourish, because they view Jews, like anybody, as important contributors to campus life and academic life and the richness of a real post-secondary education. So I think the ecosystem is moving. It's changing. It's the schools people are looking at, and I'm actually encouraged about this. I'm seeing, and in fact, my most recent podcast focuses on one such program by two leaders who are building a really interesting program at the University of Florida called the Hamilton School. One of the two, since I recorded the podcast, has just been announced that he's going to be Willem Bowden. He's going to be the provost, which is the number 2 position effectively at the University of Texas at Austin. So I think if you look at schools like, I'm just throwing these out, and UT Austin, University of Florida, Emory University, Vanderbilt University, Duke University, probably going to regret. I'm probably missing a lot of this is the danger of listing off schools, but I just know from Washington University in St. Louis, I just think a lot of these schools, they're mostly in red states, are basically saying we don't have problems with Jewish life. We don't view it as a problem or it's controversial. To the contrary, we view it as a sign of our success if Jewish students from the Northeast want to come here and from the West Coast want to come here. And we're seeking them out, and we want to make Jewish life here great and vibrant. And in fact, Jewish studies are an important part of the curriculum here for Jews and non-Jews. That's what you're seeing, by the way, at a school like University of Florida. So I actually think there's some pretty exciting things happening. The value proposition of the elite universities in terms of networks, alumni networks, in terms of the diversity of education you're going to get, in terms intellectual diversity, different viewpoints, in terms of the career prospects. I think all of those are being devalued right now. That value proposition is getting diluted. Now someone says they come from a top Ivy League school in the Northeast and they're trying to get a job at a tech company or Wall Street or wherever. There's like a question now, what kind of environment were you in? What kind of, mishigas were you involved with? Are you just like basically a glorified, entitled social activist, disguised as a graduate from, Princeton or whatever the university? I think there's a growing sense about that and a growing kind of skepticism, unless these schools really change. But I think it's going to take them a long time for them to change. And I think there are other schools at the same time that are seizing the opportunity. And I think on every one of those metrics I just gave you, intellectual viewpoint diversity, networks, career prospects, you can get all of those things. And you will increasingly be able to get all those things from schools that were not on anybody's radar, at least in the Jewish community here, as I said, a few years ago. And I think now you can get all those assets, all those benefits from these different part of the ecosystem, the university system. So I'm actually encouraged.
Dan, when you started Call Me Back, I'm guessing it was a side project, a fun hobby alongside your day job. You probably didn't imagine it would grow into what it is now. It really exploded over the past year and a half. Tell me a bit about that personal journey. I mean, what have you learned about yourself and about your Jewish identity through this podcast in these difficult times?
Look, I had a podcast before October 7th. I would deal with topics related to Israel about every 5 episodes maybe, and probably even less than that. And then October 7th happened, and then we dropped an episode on October 8th and basically didn't stop. Think back to that. Alon Benatar, who I think you know, our producer, we never actually had a conversation saying, okay, we're going all Israel all the time. We never actually sat down like on a whiteboard, said, here's the plan. It's just what we did. And we just flipped into this mode. And he and I were, kind of very aligned on just how we wanted to do things. And we just flipped into this mode where we're going all Israel all the time. And I guess what I was hoping to do was not present a particular political point of view to our audience, political meaning from within Israel, but rather to present to the world, and the world includes the Jewish community outside of Israel, to present to the world the dilemmas that Israel is facing as it navigates the post-October 7th world. That, like, these are the dilemmas. You can disagree with Israel's doing. You can agree with Israel's doing. You can like this Israeli politician. You can hate this Israeli politician. But we just want to demystify this very otherwise I think is a pretty simplistic and superficial characterization of how Israel's making decisions. We want to like break all that down so you can try to understand the conversations happening inside Israel as they wrestle with this impossible situation. That's what we were trying to do. And that was it. And we presented, like I said, all sorts of military people, civilian people, journalists, people from the right, people from the left. I have my own views. I don't hide them, but it doesn't bar me or affect the selection of the kinds of people we have on. I mean, it's just like, it's like a smorgasbord of conversations and discussion and opinions. And we want to, as Israelis and Jews and Jewish supporters of Israel, work all this stuff out. And we want to to present that to the world. It was that simple. What I didn't expect is the following. One, I didn't expect, we had no real plan. So there were no metrics. There were no milestones. We didn't expect that seemingly insatiable appetite for getting educated. We all tend to bemoan the lack, the attention deficit disorder of young people and the TikTok generation, and they can only learn something if it's presented in a 30 or 45-second reel, and nobody knows anything. And, you and I were talking about what's going on at the universities. In a sense, all that is true, but it's also true that there are a lot of people who do want to learn. And there are a lot of people who will spend the time and sit through an hour-long podcast to understand the history of UNRWA, the UN relief agency for quote unquote, for refugees that became so controversial in Gaza. Or they're willing to learn about the origins of the War of Independence. What is the history of the War of Independence? We had Benny Morris on to do a 2-part episode. So 2 long conversations about the history of the 48 War. I'm interested in these things. I wanted these topics to be out there. We would do these conversations, and they're some of our best performing episodes. Suddenly I'd find, like, how did a 2-part episode with Benny Morris about the origins of the War of Independence go viral? Like, you just wouldn't expect that. And so what it taught us is there is an appetite for getting educated, and it's not just among Jews. I mean, we have survey data on this now. About 25% of our audience is not Jewish.
Wow.
A. B, I get approached all the time. I mean, I don't name them by name, but I get approached all the time by mainstream American journalists who are not Jewish, who are working at mainstream media organizations, like many of which you know well here in the United States, that listen all the time. And now these are not people, to be clear, these are not people they're certainly not cheerleaders for Israel, but these are not people who wake up every day hostile to Israel. So they're not like, but they're, I would say, kind of left, center, and lean towards skeptical of Israel. And what October 7th made them realize, this category, is that it's more complicated than they thought. And they needed to get smart. Even if their opinions may not always land up where mine do, for instance, but they knew that they needed to get smarter about the history and then some of the conversations about what's going on right now with different people with different points of view. And so I hear from these journalists, like, they reach out to me. They're like, hey, your episode with this one, they ask me questions, follow up, so that has surprised me. I have been surprised by the number of Jews, I will say, on the American left, who listened to the podcast because they felt really isolated. We talked about people feeling isolated, Jews. I think Jews in the American left felt really isolated after October 7th. I'll never forget the turning point. I had Scott Galloway on the podcast early on, and he's a very self-described liberal progressive. You can hear him on his podcast right now. He's excoriating Trump like every other day. And he's Jewish. I mean, he never really identified as Jewish. And October 7th was a massive way. He's one of the biggest business and tech podcasters in the world. I mean, he's got a huge following. And he'd never really identified as a Jew, and October 7th shook him. Sam Harris, same thing, called himself an atheist, one of the biggest podcasters. And these guys would come on my podcast, and they would talk about what was happening in a way that I think made many American Jews on the left, who felt suddenly isolated and alone, feel like, oh, wait, like, I'm not taking crazy pills. Like, there are people who kind of get me. So our podcast became a home for a lot of those people. And then lastly, I would say the part that I really didn't expect is that we would develop such a big audience inside Israel. Never imagined that. It wasn't even, like I said, none of this was thought out. And it's funny, I hear from Israelis a lot. The 2 things I've heard from Israelis, those who have loved ones who are have been fighting in the war, or those who are connected to the hostage families movement, they just feel that the podcast is making sure the world doesn't forget about what's going on in Israel. I hear a version of that all the time, which I find very moving. They just say, like, the conversations you have and the level of detail you get into in these, it's like the world could move on. The world forgets. That's the nature of geopolitical events. And we feel like you're like not letting that happen. You're going to make sure that these conversations are happening in a very detailed way, and that it won't just fade. And I hear that a lot. I hear from, like, when I have we mentioned Nadav. When I have Nadav and like Amit Segel on, I've had members of the hostage families, people who have direct ties to current or former hostages, say, look, I disagree with everything Amit Segel says, but I'm glad he's on your podcast. I'm glad there's like a diversity of views and people understand the discussion that we're dealing with. And so I do think there are many Israelis who appreciate the podcast for that reason, which again, I didn't anticipate. And then lastly, and probably the most important, and this again, could never have imagined, and I don't really know how it happened. The podcast has kind of like a community. Like people feel a connection to the Call Me Back community, for lack of a better term. It's like they feel that there's like we're sitting around the campfire or around the Shabbos table, depending on how you look at it. And by tuning in a couple times a week, they're sitting around the Shabbos table or the campfire with us in this discussion. And that has given people some sense of, I don't know what to describe. It's very hard to describe. It's like a sense of community, a sense of comfort, a sense of connectedness. Like one guy emailed recently saying, who I don't know him, he said, I felt very disconnected from Judaism before October 7th, and I don't know anyone in Israel, and I'm not very engaged with my Judaism, but October 7th shook me. It made me want to be engaged. And the words he used, which also moved me, he says, every time I listened to Call Me Back, I felt like I was checking in with a distant cousin in Israel, and that it was my way of staying connected. So again, I couldn't, like, one would never plan all these things to happen. It's just, you couldn't imagine. It's one of the great things is, I'm sure you're learning with podcasting, is it allows you to be very experimental. And so we experimented.
I have to share with you something. A few weeks ago, I walked into our kids' Jewish school early to pick them up. And while waiting in the lobby, for once my eyes weren't glued to my iPhone, I guess. So I looked up and I noticed two clocks near the ceiling. One showed local time, the other showed the time in Jerusalem. And I smiled to myself, it's 2:00 here in New Jersey. It's 9:00 in Israel, as Israelis prepare for another day of war. And I realized that your podcast intro isn't just a super catchy line. It actually really captures something real and deep, our yearning to live on two clocks at once, to feel our hearts beating in sync with, our people there and here. Was that intentional? Did you think about that?
Not at all. It's so interesting that you say that. The only reason we did the timestamp was because the news was moving so fast, especially in those early months. And so sometimes we would record a conversation, and then for whatever reason, we weren't going to post it, record it in the morning. We were going to post it to that night or the next day. And we thought, well, wait a minute, there's so much happening that when people hear this conversation, if we're not referring in the conversation to events that have just happened, they're going to be really confused. So we timestamped it to just establish what time it was for everyone, me here in New York or my guests in Israel, so they understood where, like, to place the time while we were having the conversation. That was it. That said, to your point, the whole timestamp thing completely caught on. Like, it's become like a thing now. And every time I go speak publicly now, they, at these conferences or whatnot, they always tell me, before you start speaking, timestamp it. They want me in front of an audience of thousands of people. Be sure to do the timestamp. I mean, people are really into it. And I never took it that seriously until it was explained to me why it mattered so much to Israelis by John Polin and Rachel Goldberg. And I know you've had Rachel on your podcast. They were in New York late 2024. And I met with them. John goes to synagogue every morning for Hirsch. And so he was at synagogue that morning. And I think it may have been the first time that he had davened in a synagogue outside of Israel since Hirsch had been killed. And he said, I'm sitting there in synagogue this morning in New York. I don't know these people. They don't know me. And all of a sudden, at the end of the services, they do a prayer for the state of Israel. And they do a prayer for the hostages. And they do a prayer for the Israeli soldiers. And he's thinking, here I am in New York. It's like, I know why this matters to me, but like the idea that they're that focused and that dialed in. And he and Rachel said that that's what the timestamp means to them. That sense that we still care, that we're doing this podcast every day, and we care what time it is in Israel. We care if Israelis are starting their day or ending their day. We care if Israel just crossed 600 days of war. Like whatever I say in those first two sentences about what's going on in Israel. Or we care that, Israelis are bracing for news of a new hostage deal. We're trying to pinpoint where Israelis are at while this conversation is happening. It's like, I mean, the way they described it, they didn't use this word, but it's like the way Rachel said, it's like, in synagogue, for certain parts of the service, you turn east, to Jerusalem. That the idea is that, like, on our podcast, we're making it clear we're turning east. We're starting the conversation with that timestamp to say, let me tell you where our eyes are gazed. Our eyes are gazed to Israel, and now let's have the conversation. We're centering ourselves. How about that? That's another way to put it. Like, we're centering ourselves. We're about to have this conversation, and we're centering it in where Israelis are at. That's how people feel about the timestamp. Again, it wasn't the intention. I do think it's had that effect. And that's something else that I'm very moved by, which means for as long as we do this podcast, I'll never stop doing the timestamp.
Well, Dan, we need to wrap up. But before we depart, I invite you to take the Jewish Crossroads questionnaire. 5 quick questions. Are you ready?
Fire away.
What's your earliest
I didn't know this was part of
You didn't sign up for this.
Okay.
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
My earliest Jewish memory is probably Jewish day school. As a little kid at the United Synagogue Day School in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, 1st or 2nd grade.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
Probably Zev Jabotinsky, because I think history has shown that he, more than any other of the early visionaries about the future of the Jewish people and Jewish sovereignty in the Middle East, was right about how history would play out. And I'd love to have a conversation with him to really just get his take on where we are now and therefore where he thinks things are going, because I think he was right about where things would wind up.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
Oh, Shabbat, bar none. It's to me, it's the antidote to madness. Shabbat is the ball game. Every Friday night, we've been together for Friday night.
We have.
Every Friday night, Saul Singer and I, in our last book, The Genius of Israel, we talk about Shabbat. We called it Thanksgiving every week. We try to explain to Americans that imagine a ritual where most of the country, not everyone, but most of the country comes together at the same time with their families, with their loved ones, with their friends and community, and they just slow down. Some are more observant than others, some are more, but the ritual of slowing down, being with the people who matter most in your life, phones away, distractions away, all the focus is on intense, sometimes heated, usually joyful conversation, ritual. It is, I go on and on about Jewish traditions. And so, but that one, Shabbat, the predictability of it, it's, Rabbi Joshua Heschel said Shabbat is a palace in time. Just creating that time and the predictability and the regularity of it is the greatest technology anyone could have ever invented.
Talking about time, if you could jump 100 years into the future, what would you hope to see in just one sentence?
Israel's normalization into the rest of the Middle East. There's my one sentence. Israel's normalization and acceptance into the Middle East. And I say that as not fanciful, or I think it can happen. In fact, I think the trajectory is happening. It has some pretty big speed bumps right now, experiencing. So it's going to slow down, but it's happening. The way we talk so loosely about, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, the Israeli-Jordan peace treaty, with all the Abraham Accords, each of these have their own quirks and challenges, but the sense of a real end to the Arab-Israeli conflict and just Israel as a normal country in the region would be something I'd love to see. And like I said, I think it can happen.
What's one Jewish word, Hebrew, English, Yiddish, whatever, that feels especially meaningful to you right now?
Am I allowed to use English?
Yeah,
Or does it have
whatever language you want.
Peoplehood. I think peoplehood was a foreign concept to a lot of Jews before October 7th, and it was especially foreign to Israeli Jews. I have Israeli family. I have 2 sisters who live in Israel, lots of nieces and nephews and cousins and a lot of friends in Israel. I've always been struck by this sense of that they didn't really get peoplehood, because Israel didn't really teach peoplehood. The big mountain to climb and conquer, if you will, was establishing the Jewish state. We're here. We have the Jewish state. We're Israelis. What is this peoplehood? The connection to the diaspora was not unimportant, just wasn't a priority. I do think the sense of peoplehood now is being appreciated by more and more Jews everywhere. I feel it in both directions. it's been I've always felt it, but it's powerful to see now that's another normalization. I talked about Israel's normalization in the Middle East. Another normalization is the normalization of the idea of peoplehood.
Peoplehood. Dan, it was such a pleasure having you with me. Thank you so much. Toda rabba.
Toda rabba. Toda rabba. Thank you. Appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.